You're listening to Breakpoint This Week, where we're talking about the top stories of the week from a Christian worldview. Today we're going to talk about the aftermath of Hurricane Helene and what specifically Christians are doing in the area to help their neighbors. We're also going to talk about the one-year anniversary of the Hamas attack on Israel and what implications that has and what we've learned since then. So we have a lot to get to today, but we're so glad you're with us. Please stick around. Welcome to Breakpoint This Week. From the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, I'm Maria Baer, alongside John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center. John, this week I've been listening every morning to the World and Everything in It podcast. The World offices are located in Asheville, North Carolina. So a lot of the reporters work remotely from other cities across the country, but a lot of the administrative offices, and they have a recording studio and a studio, I think, for World Watch there in Asheville. And I've been so encouraged, burdened for them, but also encouraged. Obviously, after Hurricane Helene kind of ripped through, it caused catastrophic flooding in North Carolina, including in Asheville, and World's headquarters were completely flooded. And at the beginning of this week, they put out a call, asking for some help from donors to, start to build a fund to repair the building. And by Wednesday this week, I think Nick Eicher announced we don't need anything more. And I'm like tangentially touched by that, like so grateful that people were so generous. But I think that's just one story of the generosity that's been playing out across North Carolina and some of the areas in Florida and Tennessee that have been hit by what sounds like a sort of once in a lifetime kind of storm.
Apocalyptic, yeah. The biblical language is used at times like these, particularly in areas of the country that kind of have that religious, impulse or background to it. I was actually asked about it on my segment with World, the World and Everything in It, which you haven't heard yet because it's today, as we're recording on Friday, Culture Friday segment. And, Myrna Brown asked, why did this one sit different? She's remote. And, I really do think that losing stuff is terrible. Losing people is a whole nother level. Losing people, and all of this, takes it to another level. And all of this reflects, I think, what's true about us as human beings. That God created a lot of stuff. He only created one thing that bears his image. There may not be a more beautiful place in the world than Western North Carolina in late October. It's like a painting. It's unbelievable. And these things that add to the beauty, which are creeks everywhere, was part of the formula that led to this devastation that's just stunning. I've spent a lot of time there, just even recently. Over the last 3 years, have spoken twice to the parents at a wonderful Christian school, Asheville Christian Academy. If you were planning to give to World and they said they don't need it anymore, go to Asheville Christian Academy, a trailer park across the street washed into their buildings. And just one of the great schools, great Christian schools in America. But you're also talking about now a death toll that continues to climb, and people who live in this place that is absolutely incredible. The level of destruction is unbelievable. The videos are incredible. Our heart goes out to them. Our prayers go out to them. I'm so proud of people that, money's going out to them, and now turn that attention to as many people as we can help. Even the World story reminded me of something that I also mentioned on the World and Everything in It podcast, where you always think at times like this, at least I do, of something that Mr. Rogers said, like when you try to make sense of the evil and the suffering. And it's hard to call this evil because it was natural, but it is suffering at an incredible level. But Mr. Rogers always said, look for the helpers. There will always be helpers. And he was, I think at the time, talking about 9/11, at least that's what I was told. And that's an amazing thing too, because that says something about the kind of people we are, made in the image of God. And I think even beyond that, because at least wherever the church is, the first people in line to help are typically Christians. And, Samaritan's Purse right there. I'm sure that the Billy Graham Association, the Cove, sustained damage. I haven't heard anything specific, but, they were lined up ready to roll. wonderful school there. We talked a lot here about paraeducational options and how that's a bright light right now. And one of those is a school there in Western North Carolina in Asheville. It's a non-traditional kind of college there in Asheville, whose property is right down the road from Ridgecrest. A bunch of 20-somethings. And immediately, I think it's called Excel College. And immediately they turned their property into a distribution relief place, like overnight. And these kids turned into relief workers working 15, 16 hours a day, 19, 20-year-olds. So this is the sort of thing that people do. You kind of do it out of necessity, but you also do it out of, love for neighbor. And it's a tangible expression of that. So I wanted to high five a bunch of people there. This one hit different for me. I don't know if you've spent much time there. It's just really an incredible part of the world. I used to live in East Tennessee.
It's beautiful. Yeah.
Oh man.
I've been to the World headquarters, which was in a gorgeous building. I mean, that whole area, the whole Biltmore area is incredible.
And that whole Biltmore area is absolutely devastated. The Biltmore Village is really a beautiful and a cool place, really classy, and man, it is just devastated. But you think about the number of people that live in those communities, those small communities. I've been to Chimney Rock. I've been to, Hendersonville, spoke at another property. I haven't heard about it, called Bunclarkin, right outside of Hendersonville, from the ARP denomination. There are things that we can learn from this. And I mentioned this on The World and Everything in It. My former boss, Bill Brown, president of Bryan College, when I was there in East Tennessee, it suffered a devastating fire. I mean, in about 12 hours, the school lost all of its classroom space, all of its faculty and staff offices. And had it been 3 months earlier, would have lost its cafeteria, right? I mean, just a fire went across the top, and a whole story. The next morning in chapel, he got up and he said, we didn't lose anything important, because there was no lives lost. And that's one of the crazy stories of that is, by the way, a bag of peanut M&Ms survived that fire. It makes no sense. So next time you eat a peanut M&M, think about whatever.
That's like one of those Bible survival stories.
Except it's peanut M&Ms. I don't know. Whatever that candy coating is, good luck.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's probably not food. Okay.
I mean, if it survived a fire, I don't know what's going to happen in your digestive system, but I still like them. It was just such a profound reminder of the clarity a Christian worldview can bring to that sort of chaos. And of course, what we've seen in Western North Carolina, crazy enough, that's where he lives now. The scale of what we see in Western North Carolina, East Tennessee, they're being forgotten in all this. They're part of the suffering as well. And it's just devastating. And it's the lives lost, it's people. And I think of The Weight of Glory, where Lewis goes, cultures, nations, arts, civilizations are mortal, but it's immortals whom we talk to and work with and marry and exploit. That's what humans are. And, these sorts of events, I think, clarify that for us.
Yeah. Yesterday I heard Larry Arnn give a talk, and he was talking about how he made this differentiation between, he of course is the president of Hillsdale College. He differentiated between teaching kids and helping kids learn, basically suggesting that people have an innate desire to stretch towards knowledge. I think he was paraphrasing something Aristotle said, where we all have, we were born to know things because God made the world knowable. And so a teacher's job is to help a child realize that natural urge to learn and to know things. And I think the same thing is true about helping people or rising to an occasion when a challenge has come your way. And I think of that, the kids you're talking about in North Carolina that have started helping and they're working 16-hour days. And I wrestle with this. My kids are young, but Larry Arnn was also talking about the need, the challenge facing the generation that's in college right now, let's say, where these kids feel such a loss of agency, or they feel powerless to improve their own lives or to solve their own problems or even to face problems. And I think one of the ways you solve that is you let kids rise to the occasion of helping when disaster strikes. You know, you let kids take responsibility for something, and it is sort of like a weird alchemy, because of course I would prefer that this storm never happened, but it's a blessing that these kids have this opportunity to rise to the occasion.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And again, there are ways to see this with a bit of clarity, even when you're talking about kind of a nonsensical level of, once in a lifetime storm, Now, unprecedented is the wrong word. This has happened before in other communities. When I was a kid, I would go fishing with my father back where he was from, in the hollers of West Virginia. That's how you say that about West Virginia and Kentucky. And there had been a historic flood there from a hurricane. And I remember seeing that and going, a hurricane? Like, we're in the mountains of West Virginia.
Hundreds of miles from it's unnerving.
Yeah. And but it had dumped a bunch of water there as well. A bunch of people had died, unexpected. And I remember sitting on the bank there, actually in the river fishing, and seeing the markers of where the water had risen then. And it was like 20 feet above my head. And it was just like, how could this possibly be true? And that's the sort of catastrophe. But, another thing we saw about the human condition already, reports, a good friend that lives there texted me and said, yeah, there's been shootings and lootings and things like that. Look, that's another realistic part of the human condition as well, that humans can corrupt and be corrupted. And sometimes our systems can be corruptive. And I think our state, can govern us in such a way where we are just constantly looking for handouts, which violates what you just talked about, that Dr. Arnn had mentioned in terms of, humans want to reach out. They want to learn. They want to grow. They want to be self-sufficient. And there is so much for young people right now that's cutting their legs out from under them. It's like that line from Remember the Titans, when he's talking to his assistant coach for coddling a certain group of players. And he's like, you're crippling them. They have to be able to do this. Totally. And it's a great scene. And I love showing that movie to my son. Great movie. Yeah. Oh, man. It's good.
That's a good movie.
But that's a part of the human condition. But think about, programs, visions of education that don't teach that humans are fallen, but instead teach that you can just follow your heart. And by the way, it's one thing to believe that about the human condition, and I haven't done this very often, but it's another thing to actually structure and organize and lead and teach in such a way that aligns with that vision. And Hillsdale College is doing that in some profound ways. Like, I don't think they're batting 1,000. Nobody is, but of course, I have some personal vested interest in it, but it is unusual what they're doing. And it is based on a vision of humans as made in the image of God and all that entails. And so 2 thumbs up there. I wanted to give a shout out. But
agreed.
There is a way. I mean, you think about this, that's what a worldview is, right? It's a lens through which you see things. And if part of that lens, part of that prescription is, what kind of creatures do you think humans are? What kind of people are people? And what difference does that make? And if you come with that wrong prescription, how you think about disasters, how you think about disaster relief, how you think about education, how you think about what young people are capable of, all that's going to be either a little skewed or a lot skewed. And anyway, that's there's a lot to talk about there.
I would amend Mr. Rogers' statement there too. Like, look for the helpers and then ask yourself, like, what worldview is animating them? Because the people who are stepping up to help probably have a worldview in common that the people who are
even if they don't know it, I think that's what we see with a lot. They may not even know it, but there's just, what I saw a meme. It's like, in a disaster, one John boat full of rednecks is worth more than all of FEMA. And that's harsh, right?
But somebody posted too, like, your ability to be resilient after a natural disaster is directly correlative to how close you live to evangelicals. Like how many evangelicals are in your vicinity. And obviously it's not only evangelicals who are helping, but it's a feather in our cap. I'm really proud to be in that community.
Well, right now, the least interesting thing, which will become a far more interesting thing in a couple weeks. And to reduce this to this question, like some people are immediately, I think is in bad taste. But it is going to be interesting because this sort of stuff brings a bit of clarity as well. And in terms of those who actually vote in accordance with a vision of, our hope lies in the federal government, or not. It's going to be interesting to see. And of course, North Carolina was in a good bit of political chaos coming into this, with the revelations about the lieutenant governor who's running for governor. And, that just basically had bottomed out his candidacy. And you have a state there that votes differently for the top of the ticket versus the governor versus even the lieutenant governor at time. It's North Carolina's pretty unusual in that way. And so, that's right now, that's given the destruction, the hardship, the loss, the continued discovery of bodies. It's just going to continue to go that way for a while, tragically. And it'll be years and years of recovery here. But I think it is going to have an impact on November.
John, I want to talk about some anniversaries that we have coming up, 2 very different anniversaries. Obviously, this coming week will be 1 year since the attack in Israel by Hamas on October 7th that killed some 1,200 people and took several hundred hostages, many of whom are still being held hostage. It seems like every day we learn more about what the hostages were facing, and what, a lot of them continue to face. And then, of course, the conflict is ongoing, and Lebanon is now involved with Hezbollah, and Iran has sort of lost some of its proxies. It's kind of up to the mullahs in Iran now to decide whether they're going to get involved directly, which would be catastrophic for them, but also for Israel and for the world. It's just the tension is even higher now, if that's possible, than it was last year at this time. So it's a somber anniversary we're about to come up on. Another anniversary is a little bit more light, and that is this is the 15th anniversary this year of the signing of the Manhattan Declaration, which of course Chuck Colson helped to draft. So which anniversary would you like to start with here?
Yeah, well, I think it's probably proper to start with the one that's kind of front and center. And one that's changing so fast. I'm actually looking right now on my computer screen of a commentary that will air on Monday about the anniversary, which is Monday, October the 7th. And we've been out holding it, until today, which is kind of for production as late as we can. And I'm looking at it going, who knows what could happen between now and Monday? I mean, it's such a volatile situation, even this past week. In terms of what, Israel did to attack deep into Iran and kill the leader of Hezbollah. And then also the response where thousands of rockets rained down. And again, you saw just really a feat of defense that it's really hard to explain. I mean, even the Israelis who are used to what is an excellent interception system, they have 4 missiles. One guy was like, hey, this is a miracle, because you had essentially 3 different levels of systems working all together. One of them, by the way, is called David's Sling, which is like the greatest name ever for a defense, mechanism. And then the ones that landed were landing out in the middle of nowhere. And as this guy wrote, I think it was a whole thread on X, he said, where is nowhere in Israel? Like the place is so small. Like,
so small, yeah. You have to work to miss a target for sure.
Yeah. But of course, that's how the system works. It picks out the ones that are high potential, and then it loses the others. But on a much higher level, there's a couple things that we can say. Number one is this isn't going anywhere. Number two, it's changing really fast. Number three, think of all the things that have happened in this whole story since a year ago. And yet we still have the reality that there are lives that are just utterly devastated because of an attack. And, we talked earlier about what theologians call natural evil. And, calling it evil is something that we quibble about when you talk about a natural disaster. War is an act of moral evil. It's an evil that people do to each other. But then in both cases, there's almost like another category that needs to be offered, right? Because there are natural disasters, and then there are those natural disasters. I mean, the 2004 tsunami or something like that, where the death toll is so great. There's a story that's been going around about Western North Carolina about 2 grandparents and a kid on top of a roof, and then it collapses. It's a horrible story because it involves a child. Another story came out about that I saw, a mom talking about losing I think an 8-year-old. The acts of moral evil can fit into this category. My theology prof in college, Gary Phillips, called it maximum evil, where there's just another level. And what Hamas did on October the 7th qualifies here. You target innocent civilians, sexually assault women, old ladies, people who are just not part of this. They're just, they're not fighters. They can't fight back. And the level of calculation, the scope and the scale, and the targets. And there's just something when you kind of throw in categories of kind of innocence or, the innocent bystander that, and certainly children, that it takes it to another level. And that triggers a level of, I think, grief and suffering and retaliation and response that just is, again, to our point of the last conversation, you got to get the human condition right. And you kind of look at this and you go, who are those people who say that humans are born good? Who are those people that say we should just follow our hearts, and that our hearts will never lead us wrong? And, what world are they actually looking at? Because it does not correspond and align with reality. And you do have an awful lot of that kind of progressive vision about humanity that is shaping the response of even world leaders to Israel's actions. And Israel clearly hit a point at a year ago where they were like, the criticism, which they really have taken seriously in a lot of places, but they're clearly like, look, you guys don't get it. And, that's not going to shape your disappointment with us isn't going to matter because we're dealing with something else. And that something else is what I'm talking about in terms of getting the human condition right.
Yeah. And I think so. I want to share a story about that has been haunting me since October 7th. And I heard it in an interview on a podcast. I can't remember which, but it's an Israeli mom. Her name is Sophie Berzon Mackey. So she was for 12 or so hours in a safe room in her house with her 12-year-old daughter and 3-year-old daughter. And she talked in this interview, like really hauntingly, about all of the emotions you go through over that period of time in a situation like that. And eventually actually heard the terrorists outside of her house, banging on the windows, banging on the walls, and had sort of come to the conclusion that they were going to be killed and that this was the end for her. And I was fascinated by this story for a lot of reasons. But one of them is, you can't imagine what you can think that you can imagine what would go through your head. And I wrote a column about this back when it happened and was talking about how if there was a movie about this situation, what this mom would be doing in these last moments is like, heroically lifting the car off her kids, proverbially speaking. She's trying to figure out till the last moment, how can we survive? And that's not what happened. She said that where her mind went was that, okay, we're probably not going to survive this. But the worst thing that she could imagine was seeing the look on her daughter's faces, right? When the terrorists make it into the room. That's not something you could predict. Like no movie writer who doesn't have children or hasn't been in a situation like this would understand that that's where a mom's mind goes. But it was. And somehow the IDF got there around the same time. I don't think she even knows the logistics of all of it, but they were saved. And the terrorists coming into their house were killed. Praise God. But the most incredible thing about this story is that when she was talking to this reporter after the fact, he said something like, how do you move on from this? What do you do now? How do you serve? Like, are you, you've had this incredible trauma, unbelievable, the situation is still ongoing in Israel. And she said, I honestly looked at my husband and said, we should just have another baby. That was her response. And I I have thought about that almost every day since October 7th, because that is one of the fundamental differences between the worldview of the people who survived this attack and who are being attacked in Israel and the worldview of the people perpetrating this attack.
Yeah.
And God will preserve his people. And also to reach through to that level of acceptance, there's evil in the world. And the best way for me to combat it is to make more people.
Yeah.
I mean, I still get emotional thinking about
that story is going to play into our next story, because that is a remarkable response. And it is a incredible example of this idea of you got to get the human condition right. So think about the mass protests that we saw over the last year. That's part of the developments against Israel, and Israel being the bad guy. Well, that's a worldview. That's a lens that we have called the critical theory, kind of mood lens, right? Where you've already decided who the good guys are and the bad guys are, and the bad guys can't do anything bad enough. And the good guys can't do anything bad enough to be bad, and the bad guys can't do anything good enough to be good. And that's the critical theory mood that's applied,
I want to petition that we stop even calling it the critical theory, because that sounds too academic. It just needs to be called like foolishness or blindness or whatever else.
Proverbs would probably agree with you, although it goes with the word folly. And I think folly is one of the great words ever in the history of the human language. It just communicates like, are you kidding me?
It's doing a lot of work. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I think that's such a great story. And again, we're going to hit another story later, and this is going to play into this. But it also plays into the story of the Manhattan Declaration. And it's hard to put these two together, and I'm not equating them in any way. It's just something that has to be noted because, at that point, 15 years ago, three men, Chuck Colson, Timothy George, Robert George, noticed that there was something that needed to be addressed, which isn't that it was sometimes kind of portrayed as, Christians calling the culture to agree with Christians. If you look at the document, that's never what it was about.
Right.
It was calling Christians like, look, you need to have clarity on the implications of your faith. And three critical areas, foundational areas, that if you don't get these right, you're not going to get a lot of other things right. Life, marriage, religious liberty. Religious liberty is kind of a politically charged language for what they were actually talking about, which is this: your conscience belongs first and foremost to God. And we haven't had to really choose between God and the state, but there are increasing ways in which we're showing real cracks in the system. And that's where that very last line, which probably was the most quoted line from the Manhattan Declaration, which, by the way, about 500,000 Christians signed in America. It was dedicated to America. And then I don't know how many nations around the world there were groups of people who took it and adopted it for their own national context. But the last line is, we will ungrudgingly render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, but we can never render to Caesar what belongs to God. And the first two things belong to God. And that's kind of what one of that allegiance of crisis that they were addressing. Those first two things really belong to God, which is the definition of marriage and the definition of human life and the value and the sacredness of human life. And you think about having that sort of clarity, like that mom that in that story you just told, and you say, well, do I have that sort of clarity? Do Christians have that sort of clarity? And as we move, I was having this conversation last night with a dear friend. He's like, we have to reckon with the fact that we're in Babylon, like we're not in a context. And honestly, his wife brought up something I thought was very important, which is, some people think if the election goes this way, we won't be in Babylon. If the election goes this way, we will be in Babylon. No, we're in Babylon both ways. Now, there was a Babylon under Cyrus, and there was a Babylon under Darius, and there was a Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. And the one under Nebuchadnezzar, went up and down in terms of how bad, but we're still across the board, in Babylon. So the clarity of our convictions that God is the author and definer of life, that God is the author and definer of the human order, which includes and begins with the definition of marriage, and that I have to give those things to God because they don't belong to Caesar, right? It's interesting now to do kind of a "you are here" moment That's the phrase we're kind of using around the Colson Center to talk about 2024, is there was so many things that kind of were like this big map and go, you are here. And I think we maybe thought we weren't. We thought we were somewhere else, but we are here. And you kind of think, okay, on life, are we more or less committed to the sacredness of all life? The allies that we thought we had, we don't have. The kind of pro-life impulse that we thought the younger generations had really are, corrupted by a view of morality that is personal, not absolute, and relative and individualistic. And our understanding of the sacredness of marriage, especially as it relates to the first one, life, and where life and the connection between marriage and children and parental rights and who children belong to, all that's kind of, muddled in here. And what we're going to talk about the next segment is this demographic crisis that's apparently, if this chart we just were given is true, is way worse than we thought it was.
Yeah.
It's just not clear that Christians have maintained that clarity about the definition and sacredness of life as an absolute of the human condition and the definition of marriage. And that no matter how culture shifts and no matter how the forces of culture and new Caesars claim to have, authority over these areas, these things belong to God. It might be time to dig that document up and look at it again and say, kind of where are we?
That's what I wanted to ask you. I'm going to ask you to do your favorite thing that you get asked to do way too often, which is tell me what Chuck would say if he were still alive and looking at the state of culture in 2024, having drafted this document. Would he be encouraged? Like, did the document do things that he was hoping it would do, or would he be discouraged, do you think?
He wouldn't be discouraged. He would be animated first. And the difference is whether you think that any sort of cultural reality leads you to despair or rightfully as a Christian or not. And I don't think he would have. I think he would have been animated because he really believed that Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. It fundamentally changed his life and ordered the next 3 or 4 decades of his life. And he loved to quote Father Newhouse, who is a collaborator of his on a number of things, including the Manhattan Declaration, who said, the Christian has not right to despair because to despair is a sin. And the Christian has not reason to despair, quite simply because Christ is risen. And he would have applied that to this election cycle. And he would have said that to some of his closest friends and longtime supporters who are saying things in a despairing, apocalyptic tone, as if the problem here is what happens or doesn't happen in November.
Yeah.
He would say it differently, and he would call them to faith in Christ because he believed that that was actually the right thing. Now, he would also say that the problem is not them, the problem is us. That it's the church being the church. The problem is not when the world's not the church. The problem is when the church is not the church, including our fundamental beliefs and what we stand on. And he would be calling people from all angles, from those to the left of him and those to the right of him, back to this reality that Christ is risen, and that is the linchpin of the biblical story, which begins in creation and marriage and the Christian responsibility to testify to the existence of God in Christ and all that, which he would see these causes who our conscience belongs to, what belongs to God, what belongs to Caesar, the definition of marriage and the definition of life being a part of that. So I think I'm pretty convinced that's what he'd say. Now, I'm not going to say it. I'm not going to say that what we're going to get here are dozens of responses from people who are going to tell us what Chuck Colson would have said at this time. Yeah, because I get that a lot, and that's fine. I appreciate that his legacy goes on like that. And of course, there are a lot of people who are too young to remember Chuck and too young to remember kind of how he shaped the evangelical conscience and the evangelical mind, and God used him in that way. But there are those that continue to wrestle with that. And I think that's helpful, honestly. It's the same thing as, somebody in a particular denomination saying, are we still in line with what the founder of our denomination would have said? Are we still in line with what this great thinker, Dr. Ongoing, are we still in line with Aristotle as an example of that? But I think the Manhattan Declaration was a moment in time, and it called Christians, to things that matter, and they still matter. And so the question is, what are we in line with these things right now and more? It's not just those things.
I think that's sort of what I'm discouraged by. And I've always appreciated about you, John, that you seem a little bit more cynical than Chuck. I never met Chuck, but you seem a little bit more cynical, and that I feel a little bit more cynical. So you and I have that in common. We have that camaraderie. But it's hard not to be discouraged because I'm not going to let you respond to that. I see people who signed the Manhattan Declaration who don't seem to be there anymore. And that is discouraging because I think that's why I asked you what you think Chuck would think now, because I think there was so much foresight, because it felt in 2009 even that putting a stick in the ground and saying life is life and here's why it's valuable, or marriage is marriage and here's why it's valuable, it almost felt like, why is this even necessary? Everybody knows that, or whatever. It certainly felt more quaint than it does now, but he knew that this was coming. That there will come a day when it will be hard for you to acknowledge that this is true, socially hard, not factually difficult, but socially hard. And too many people were ready to sign it at the time and don't seem to be ready to sign it now.
I think that's probably true, but I think that's probably true of all the great statements, even the greatest ones. I mean,
totally.
If you think about the ideas at the root of the Protestant Reformation, entire denominations that came out of the Protestant Reformation basically reject half of the things that Luther said, right? So, and I'm not equating the Mandek with, Luther's 95 Thesis or anything like that, which, by the way, the great Halloween costume still for Protestants is to dress up in burlap and nail 95 Reese's to your front door. Huh? Have you never seen that? No, that's a great idea. There you go. You can be a witness to
I'm going with peanut M&Ms this year. They're immortal.
Apparently, they'll survive even if your house burns down. But sure, there are those, but of course, that's what we know. That some fall away and some change their minds and that sort of stuff. I do think if you look at the last 15 years where we were facing a cultural foe that was pretty dramatic, that there was a lot of things that were mobilized in terms of partnership and unity, and the church being, working together across confessional lines, even around pointing to things that are really important. The Mandate probably had something to do with some of those relationships being strong and strengthened. But, I don't think Chuck ever thought, and we shouldn't have thought, that these things are, kind of silver bullets. And I think that's a mistake. Like they're signing something under oath. You said, man, in 2009. Well, but even to mobilize kind of victory, quote unquote, in these areas, and it's the same misguided thing when we look at an organization and say, this organization is going to save America, or this organization is going to deliver us. I'm thinking about that a lot going to this election where, there are a lot of organizations that have put a lot of energy in it, and God bless them. And a lot of them are doing really good and important work, and they're clarifying issues. All that stuff's really important. And yet the most important factors that are impacting the outcome of this election, nobody had any control over. You look at, for example, the changing at the top of the Democratic ticket. These organizations didn't deliver that. That was just, nature taking its course in a sense and finally being exposed. And you look at, the North Carolina being an important kind of factor in this, and then this terrible storm, and how's that going to affect it? I think it will. And I, now it doesn't mean that money was poorly spent. I'm sure some of that money was, you don't spend that amount of money without it being poorly spent at some point, some parts of it. But I'm not saying that their efforts are bad. And this is I think the last thing that I'll say that Chuck Colson would have said, because he said it in a number of ways. He didn't always say it the way that T.S. Eliot said it, but it was the same thing. On his desk was a plaque that said, faithfulness, not success. The results aren't up to us, basically. T.S. Eliot said, for us, there's only the trying and the rest is none of our business. And I always loved that quote. He said it so well because, let's do everything we can. Let's try stuff. Let's throw stuff against the wall and then see what sticks. And if it sticks, then God brings those results, right? We plant, we harvest, God brings the increase. I think Paul says this. And And I think that's true across the line, whether we're talking about our best efforts to mitigate disasters sometimes don't work, and our best efforts to spread the gospel sometimes don't work, and our best efforts to disciple Christians and, how to live in this challenging moment. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't work. This, it doesn't give us an excuse to do dumb things or to be foolish, in your proverbial word, or to embrace bad ideas, or to think that the ends justify the means. Like we got to do whatever it takes in order to get the ends that we want. It's just the ends belong to God. And I think that there has to be a recognition of that. And I do think that, Chuck would have heard, some of these things like, look at that original list of signers, this guy's a casualty, that guy fell off, this woman's no longer there, whatever. And I haven't looked at that for a while. Maybe it's not as bad as you're making it out to be. I'll just say that out loud. It's not as bad, you cynic. And, as you're making it out to be.
Redeem your cynicism. Got it.
Right. But that's never what it was all about. Yeah. Let's do what we can. Let's be clear where we can and leave the results to God. And, I think that's what we're called to do.
John, I want to talk to you now about the Montana Mountain King goat.
This is the greatest.
Wait. A hybrid
story.
Sheep. Is it a goat or a sheep?
How you're introducing this segment, given what we're going to talk about, people are going to be really confused. So we're going to have to, thread some needles, but you're not wrong to mention it. I don't know what it is.
Okay. I don't know what it is either. I'm just going to read the first part of the story that was in The Guardian. So U.S. man, he was 81
years old,
sentenced to 6 months for creating a giant hybrid sheep for hunting. And then there's a picture of the Marco Polo sheep. An 81-year-old Montana man was sentenced Monday to 6 months in federal prison for illegally using tissue and testicles from a large sheep hunted in Central Asia and the U.S. to create hybrid sheep for captive trophy hunting in Texas and Minnesota. So the craziest part of the story is the judge says he struggled to come up with a sentence. Can you imagine being that judge? Like, I don't even know what to say about this.
So there's two directions this story can go. All right. One is the most obvious one, which people are like, cloning sheep. Like, we haven't heard about that since Dolly, Right. And Dolly was such a disaster that was proclaimed to be a success, the only successful attempt out of like hundreds. And some of the others were deformed, and Dolly developed lung disease and died early. And, but that was a long time ago. It's probably 25 years ago. And now you have a rancher in the middle of Montana, like successfully cloning sheep for trophy animals. But that's not where we're going with this.
He's
it's
like
not
CRISPRing the sheep. He's genetically modifying them to create.
But that's not where we're going to go. Where we're going to go is the ethical complications of our technologies going forward and being impacted by the single most important story of our lifetime that very few people are talking about. All right. So you got to hang with us. It involves China and all kinds of other things.
Take us on a journey.
All right, here we go. The most important story that no one is talking about is the demographic winter that the world is facing. 2 weeks ago on Bill Maher's show, he made a joke about overpopulation. Overpopulation is what we call a zombie idea. It still is this myth that keeps rising from the dead that is absolutely not true. This week, the latest numbers of fertility rates around the world were released. Fertility rates mean basically the average number of children for the average woman. And the number has to be 2.1 to have basically a sustainable future. So every woman needs to have an average of 2.1 kids. Whenever I talk about this to high school kids, they're like, what's a 0.1 kid? And I'm like, it's not a Cocker Spaniel. It's an average. It's called math, kids. I know it's, but the point is that when I first started tracing this, which was well over 10 years ago, it was because of being exposed to the work of a researcher on this demographic number who was starting to notice the falling below of fertility rates across the Western world, a guy named Bernard Lewis. His numbers were, the replacement rate is actually not 2.1, it's actually 2.4. And the other big number he gave was 1.7, which is once you fall below that fertility rate, for any extended period of time, it's very hard to recover because you just have this cascading effect of not enough kids marrying not enough kids and that sort of stuff. And it's just too hard to recover. At the time, there were just a handful of countries, Scandinavian countries, very highly secularized countries that were meeting that 1.7 number. Most were falling below 2.1, but hadn't fallen below 1.7. This number has been in decline ever since. It leveled out a bit in some countries during COVID. And by leveling out, it's like, imagine this kind of downward trajectory to the right. And then, it kind of smooths out. And then what we're seeing now since COVID is a falling off the cliff. These numbers are so absolutely alarming. We're just not having enough children. And what this means is, unless there's a reversal, and the problem is with these numbers, it's hard to imagine a reversal, then you're going to see dramatic drops. In other words, the overall trend line for the global population, given how widespread these numbers are, it really is hard to imagine. We now look and say every city I go to feels crowded. Every airport, certainly the Denver airport, feels inexplicably crowded. Who are these people? Where are they all going? Why are the roads all clogged? And that's how we sense and that's how we feel it. But you can look to China, where you have these infrastructures built for these large populations, and you're starting to see some of them abandoned because they, of course, have tried to control fertility in through the one-child policy. And then they realized, oh no. And they went to a two-child policy and now a three-child policy. And they sustained this falling below the fertility rate for so long that now they had infrastructure that they had to build for their quote unquote overpopulated country that now is lying empty. So imagine, 100 years, 50 years from now, when you kind of see this all play out and the cascading effect of not enough children marrying and having children with not enough children and so on. Where does this leave us? Well, it leaves with a global population that is dramatically declining. Now, here's what I mean when I say these numbers are bad. There are very few Western countries that are meeting that 1.7 mark. America is below the 1.7 mark. No one's close to 2.1 in the Western world. It's also spread to the developing nations like Mexico. The Western nation that was the longest holding on was Australia. It's now below that 1.7 mark, not just 2.1, although the chart looks at the last couple of years. Think about kind of the former Soviet countries, that are really part of the developing world. None of these countries are meeting this. Now, you also have the challenge that in a lot of Western countries, think Russia or, global dominant countries, the population rate is so low. And yet the ones that are still having children there, and you could say the same thing about Britain, you can say the same thing about France, tend to be Islamic families. What's interesting is when I first started looking at this, most Islamic countries, their numbers were like 7. All right.
Wow.
What's interesting is the Islamic countries that are listed in this chart are now below 4. So you're seeing this global trend, even as many of these Islamic countries become more and more Westernized. One of the most interesting ones is Iraq. Now, of course, where Iraq's going to go, with the Taliban back in control and the subjugation of women, we'll see. What's not shown here are the kind of, Indonesian Islamic countries, which tend to have a really high birth rate still, and the African ones. But there's like the only exceptions of countries that are meeting this replacement rate are Islamic countries, but they have plummeted too. Except for there's this handful. We're seeing an uptick in Hungary because of some policies of Orban. And Israel is now stays above the replacement rate, which is crazy considering what they've gone through over the last 2 years. Now, some of those numbers of October 7th, and being in wartime, which tend to drop those numbers, haven't been kind of fully reckoned with given the timing of it. But you're seeing a global antinatalism. You're seeing some very acute issues you talk about in a country like China. Where is this all going? First of all, we've all collected in cities. What happens if the global population drops by 20, 30, 40% in the coming decades? What happens to all this infrastructure that we're building, right? the whole conversation around paid family leave in the vice presidential debate. You look at this and you go, by the way, I'm for paid family leaves. What families? Like these numbers are showing there's just that not many workers that are kind of coming. And it's kind of classic, like the government swooping in to solve a problem that no longer exists after it's been a problem for years. China, though, this is where the sheep comes in. Okay.
Yeah. Connected to the sheep for us.
All right. Every few years you hear this headline of some scientists in China that have cloned embryos and grown them to certain cell counts and that sort of stuff. If an 81-year-old man in Montana is cloning sheep, you know that those stories in China are way worse, right? Because there are the very little bioethical kind of regulatory framework things that we impose on our science, they've got none. And especially if it's being driven by state concerns and state wants. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. So here's what we're going to see within 40 years in China. Two things. Number one, because they're going to control the population. They understand the consequences, for example, for caring for the elderly and providing the social safety net, which is way, way, way bigger. And, basically this kind of state enforced communist thing. What we're going to see in our lifetimes, you and me and our age people, is China go from a one-child policy to forced fertility. We will see that. We will see them going from you can't have any more than one child to you have to have children. Mm-hmm. We've already talked about how that shift has gone from don't have too many children to government officials calling newlyweds and encouraging them to have some babies. Mm-hmm. So, encouragement to state regulatory, that's a small step indeed, especially there. And this, maybe I'm completely jumping the gun here on this sheep, which was a crazy story. But if an 81-year-old rancher in Montana is able to clone sheep, China's cloning humans. That in terms of our biggest, a nation like that thinking their biggest hole in natural or national resources is the lack of humans, you're going to see the human cloning, I think there. And you think about the ethical things that this creates. Forced fertility and human cloning. Now, look, everyone's going to go, you're crazy. Stone Street, you're off your rocker. You heard it here first. I'm just dropping my mic right here. That's what I'm thinking we're going to see. Last thing I'll say, what an opportunity for the church. Do we believe babies are good? One of our colleagues just told my wife and I a story, a young couple in a small group at a church, and was asked, what's marriage for? Went around the room. The answer was, it's about friendship. It's about showing Christ's love to somebody else. Da, 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 da. He piped up and goes, I think all that's really important, but the core thing is about having babies. And the leader told him not to bring stuff like that up again because there were young couples there who were married who had chosen not dealing with infertility, who had chosen not to have children. Folks, what that reveals is, what do we mean by discipleship? How are we discipling young couples to be married? This is, to go back to the Manhattan Declaration. Manhattan Declaration was just talking about the definition of marriage. You can't get the definition of marriage if it's disconnected for what the purpose of marriage. I'm not saying the only purpose of marriage is procreation, but to say that procreation is not a purpose of marriage and to bring that up offends people who, haven't followed their heart that way. This is the confusion. And so here we have maybe an incredible opportunity for Christian witness, pointing to God's created order as good. And you told the story of the Israeli mom facing this incredible evil and going, I'm going to have another baby.
Like if everything's broken, that's the answer, right? That's where you're minding. I mean,
not the only answer, but the idea that it is an answer is remarkable. I'm just thinking of how many people are listening to this woman going, you're crazy. Why would you say that? Like that response is unimaginable to people.
But you even pointed out how the fertility rate kind of plateaued or even improved a little bit during COVID, which makes very little sense if you have the worldview that people only have babies when they feel completely secure and they know they can handle it and everything's great and it's going to be a wonderful life for this child. That's the only time people will feel comfortable enough to have children. Not true.
No.
Not true.
That one might have more to do with everybody was at home with a whole lot of time on their hands.
Well, okay,
I'm just going to say.
But But listen, I think that, and you're right. I don't mean to say that's the answer. I mean, for this woman in particular, and I completely identify with this sentiment, when you've had children before and you know what that is and what it's like in your life, when everything feels chaotic and unpredictable and also horrible, that is the light that you understandably would grab onto. And it makes me think of something I heard, of all people, Tucker Carlson say at a speech that he gave a while ago, which was, anybody telling you not to have children is not your friend. And I extend that to anybody who's, especially if you're in a marriage that is fertile and, if you have, this is the life that you've got right now. If people aren't encouraging you to have children, they're not your friend. And I'm not talking about this from like even a utilitarian or a population sense, but there's just, in my life, there's nothing better. I'm sure you and Sarah would say something similar. And it's a waste for people to miss out on that when they have the opportunity. Yeah,
and our hearts and prayers go out to the people who want it and can have it.
Absolutely.
Right now, given this kind of antinatalism. But I already know then what you're dressing up for is Halloween. You're going to dress up as Margaret Atwood and the Red Hoods and you Handmaid's Tale woman. I'm just kidding.
That's my speed.
That's it, man. No,
have them babies.
I guess, what struck me about the Israeli woman story is just that response is so, it's not just, wow, it's that for many people, that's just an unimaginable response, right? And it goes to what we talked about also with Worldview in terms of plausibility, right? That's just not a believable position and for many people. And it does reflect an awful lot. So it is really important, right? That Christians understand what's true about the world, what's true about the human person and people, and then understand that our lives are in a response to God, and a calling. So it's kind of truth, identity, calling. I've really settled into as being foundational to a Christian worldview and what we mean when we say a Christian worldview, so that it's not academic sounding, as you accused me of earlier. There's more to come on this demographic story, though. Look, it is the most important factor facing human civilization.
It's just hard to convince people of that because, like you said, it's just impossible to see. Because
it's impossible to get through Denver's TSA checkpoints.
Okay, Denver's airport is a Denver's airport problem. That's not a population problem. That's a Denver problem.
It's made worse by the amount of people there. But you're right, because I would agree that every single time they find something that helps, they squander it.
It is the most ridiculous airport. Maybe we'll find out in 20 years it's been a social experiment.
It is. I think it is. We should have known because of that demonic horse that's out there with the red eyes. But it really is this. It's amazing. Like you just like we moved out here in 2007. So I'm just like, how do you systemically make things more complicated?
Every time.
I actually told the TSA supervisor once, I was like, have you ever just gathered a bunch of us who travel a lot? Because we could probably help. You just gather us, call us down, buy us pizza, and we will tell you how to reorder things. And the answer is they didn't. And they put the thing under construction for 1 million years. And then they opened this whole west side in which everything's worse. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I will stop now because that's not the demographic problem we're talking about.
We'll talk about that next week. Right, we'll put it in segment 1. Okay, let's do recommendations real quick. What do you have for us this week, John?
I want to recommend a segment in a podcast called The Editors, which is from National Review. And here's why. We didn't talk about the dock workers' strike. Right. Mainly because I don't know anything about it. But fascinatingly enough, they also didn't talk about it at the vice presidential debate, which they should have. It's really, really important. Fascinating, even in terms of what we were talking about today, in terms of the human condition and what we think about the definition and the reality and the meaning of work plays into this. And also just the history of the unions, the dock unions on the West Coast versus the East Coast, which are two different things. None of this I knew. I now know it because of a segment around the 50-minute mark in the most recent, I say most recent, go back to Tuesday because they release usually on Tuesday and Friday. So I imagine there's another one coming today. But if you go back to Tuesdays, there is a segment there right around around the 50-minute mark, if I'm right, and where he walks through the dock workers strike and the history of these unions and so on. It really is fascinating. His line was, on the West Coast, the dock unions are run by communists. On the East Coast, they're run by the mafia. And there's a whole history. Oh, yeah, no, it's just crazy. But that's not even the most important headline of this whole thing, or the most important point. But there's just that kind of detail about the history and why this matters and where this is going and that sort of stuff. What the demands are, which is they're insane. This is not, get on the side of the working man sort of, rhetoric. It just isn't. Anyway, thought it was really helpful. I didn't know a lot. Maybe other people want to know more about that. The Editor's podcast, right around the 50-minute mark. What's the guy's name? I think the guy's name's Dominic, who kind of describes it and does a great job.
I guess as the population continues to decline, these kind of unions will have better leverage, right? There's fewer people to do the jobs. That'll be interesting to watch too. That'll take longer. All right. I'll just recommend really quick a podcast as well. I've been listening over the last couple of days, every time I'm in the car, to Douglas Murray on Honestly with Barry Weiss, reflecting on the last year after the Hamas attack on October 7th. So it's a timely conversation. And he's been in and out of Israel in this entire year and has done reporting that nobody else has done, and talked to so many people, from families to Netanyahu, and has an incredible perspective on this, and is also just a really eloquent speaker. He's a delight to listen to, even about something as sad and heavy as this. He quotes T.S. Eliot, John. I thought you'd be proud of that, which was beautiful. But the episode is called A Time of War. It's on the Honestly podcast with Douglas Murray, and I can't recommend it highly enough. All right. Well, John, that is going to do it for the show today. Thank you so much for listening to Breakpoint this week from the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I'm Maria Baer, alongside John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center. Wishing you a wonderful week, and we'll see you all back here next week.